Good morning, teacher. We are Fer and Paulina, and we are going to present our translation and analysis of the poem The Raven. The author is Edgar Allan Poe, and the year of publication was on 1845. Now, the literature movement is the Romanticism, and the social context was given by Poe himself in his essay, The Philosophy of Composition. So he establishes like a brief methodology for writing, and he says that it is more important to identify before the feelings, the objective, and the impact in the audience, and after being focused on the characteristics, the setting, the problem, and the argument of the poem. So also he mentions some literature references related like to the main character of his poem, which is the raven. And he also says that he took the melancholy and sorrow from other authors.
Okay. Now, that's right. Okay. Suppose the main objective of this translation is to provide a translation of the poem The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. I made the students of English teaching and learning, students of the translation course, students of the language literature, and for all those who are readers of classic literature texts. Likewise, the aim of this translation is to respect the format and content of the poem without falling back on the literal translation. But without falling so much into the rhyme scheme. The function of the text is expressive literative and belongs to the genre poetry of the narrative subgenre. Okay, the process this translation was carried out by the means of the literal translation, although it didn't cover all the text, as some parts it could be done through this process. Part it was done considered that the poem has a regular metric, but has a complicated rhyme. It composed for 3 stanzas of 6 lines each. I think that the rhyme scheme is A, B, C, B, B, B. So from this perspective, it was complicated to translate. On another hand, Bianet and Darbelet, quoted by Lopez and Minet, tell us that the literal translation is the transposition word for word of the language from a language to another, respecting the linguistic reserves of the target language.
Yeah, so now let's move into the difficulties. So along 2 semesters with the same subject, we were able to recognize one of the most important difficulties, and that is like the translator as a writer. So when we first read the poem, easily we found some aspects as to rhymes, the tone of the poem. As we've mentioned before, we decided not to keep the rhymes because we will probably like sacrifice the content, and we didn't want to. So because we prefer to find the most accurate equivalences for some sentence or words, and keep the sense and interpretation of the poem. So as we've seen, literature and translation but cannot exist without the other. So we as external like people in writing poems, we prefer to contribute to give another interpretation of it, because at the end of the day, that is what a translation is an interpretation of any text. Now we have some procedures and techniques. One procedure that we identified is the lexical partial calc, which consists in the substitution of synonyms in the second text. For example, we have forgotten lore for sabiduría olvidada. Another example of typographical calc are all those capital letters to keep the structure of the poem. So another important calc is the one of certain uses of inverted commas, which is present at the end of every stanza with the purpose of emphasize words like nothing else and evermore.
Okay, use of the theory. Dos Santos and Alvarado tell us that the translation of a literary work implies a linguistic and cultural knowledge. That is the intellectual operation that involves a personal technical commitment. What we have started noticed when we do this translation, there were some words that we didn't know their meaning and how these words have been used by and for the context. This also includes how we modify the text, giving our versions, respecting the author's idea. So we also set ourselves the task of researching more relevant information about the poem, about the author, and his way of writing. The task of translating become a mechanism of searching for a permanent linguistic equivalence. I mean, finding the right words to make the text understandable, adapting it to Spanish, and adapting it to the Mexican student context.
Yes, so now let's move on to our final thoughts. And this is the question, like, how did taking a translation course help me in my teacher training as a student and in my teaching practice as a future teacher? So we will think that as students, taking two translation courses help us to improve the acquisition of language, since vocabulary to understand and also identify how the writing process may help to our comprehension of some structures in English and even in Spanish.
Okay, according with Villan, we also see ourselves in the role of the translator as writer as translator, since translation is precise over a by double translation process, so speech and speech writing. In another hand, Ortega tells us about lo inefable y lo inefado. Um, these allude, the ineffable alludes to the fact that each language is shaped by the different selective spirit that acts on the vocabulary, morphology, syntax, and writing of the sentences of periods. And the inefado is everything that language could say, but which each language silence, in the hope that the reader can must assume it and add it to it. Literature translation lends itself being molded in a different way. So the point of the science in itself to the reader can understand it and add it to it. So for that's all for our part. Thank you for being here and watching our video.